The maps were wrong. Oberstleutnant Werner Heidelberg realized this on the morning of March 7, 1943, not through revelation but through the slow, creeping dread that comes from adding numbers that refuse to make sense. He sat in a cramped office on the third floor of the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, surrounded by documents stamped Geheime Reichsake, secret Reich matter. Rain streaked the windows, blurring the gray city beyond. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of fear that had settled over German military intelligence like morning frost. Before him lay a series of reports compiled over 6 months. Photographic reconnaissance from long-range Condor flights over the Atlantic. Intercepted shipping manifests. Agent reports from neutral ports in Spain and Sweden. Signal intelligence from submarine observations off the American coast. Each document, taken alone, seemed unremarkable. Together, they formed a picture so overwhelming that Heidelberg's hand trembled as he reached for his pencil. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The assignment had seemed routine when it landed on his desk in September of 1942. Assess American petroleum production capacity. Identify vulnerabilities for U-boat targeting. Standard intelligence work for the Kriegsmarine's operational planning. Heidelberg, 41 years old, a veteran of the Great War and a trained economist before joining the Abwehr, approached it methodically. He began with German assumptions, the baseline from which all analysis proceeded. Germany's own petroleum situation was well documented. The Reich produced approximately 124,000 barrels of crude oil daily from domestic wells in Hanover and Austria, pathetically small compared to wartime needs. Synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Politz, and Blechhammer added another 70,000 barrels per day through the Fischer-Tropsch process, converting coal into liquid fuel. Romanian oil fields, vital to German survival, contributed roughly 100,000 barrels daily. Combined, the Greater German Reich had access to perhaps 300,000 barrels per day, a figure already straining under military demands. The Luftwaffe consumed 40,000 barrels daily just to maintain reduced operations. The Kriegsmarine needed 25,000 barrels for its surface fleet and U-boat arm. The Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions required another 60,000 barrels for tanks, trucks, and artillery tractors. What remained, barely enough for training, reserves, and the industrial economy, existed in a state of perpetual crisis managed by Albert Speer's ruthless prioritization committees. Heidelberg had assumed, as did most German planners, that America faced similar constraints, perhaps on a larger scale given its continental size, but fundamentally bounded by the same geological and industrial realities that governed all petroleum production. The first reports suggested otherwise, but he dismissed them as errors, the numbers too absurd to take seriously. A reconnaissance photograph taken by a Condor on January 12, 1943, showed the coastline near Houston, Texas. The analyst's notes described what appeared to be a petroleum refinery complex covering an area of approximately 12 square kilometers. 12 square kilometers. The entire Luna synthetic fuel plant, Germany's largest, occupied 1.3 square kilometers. Heidelberg assumed it was multiple facilities photographed as one, an optical illusion of overlapping images. Then came the shipping data. Swedish commercial attaches in New York, providing intelligence through circuitous channels, reported observing convoys departing every 72 hours carrying refined petroleum products to Britain. Each convoy consisted of 30 to 40 tankers, each vessel carrying between 8,000 and 12,000 tons of fuel. Heidelberg calculated the numbers, then recalculated them, certain he'd made an error. If the reports were accurate, America was shipping more petroleum to Britain every month than Germany produced in 6 months. The mathematics seemed impossible. Either American production exceeded German estimates by an order of magnitude, or the reports contained systematic errors that invalidated the entire intelligence picture. He requested clarification from field agents. The responses took weeks to filter back through neutral countries, each one more disturbing than the last. An agent in Lisbon reported Portuguese tankers arriving from Texas refineries with loads that exceeded the monthly output of Romania's Ploiești fields. A source in Buenos Aires described standard oil tankers making weekly runs from Venezuela carrying quantities that strained belief. Most troubling, a neutral shipping expert in Stockholm provided manifests showing American coastal tanker traffic moving petroleum from Gulf Coast refineries to East Coast ports at volumes that suggested the existence of an entirely unseen industrial infrastructure. Heidelberg began cross-referencing with other intelligence sources. The Forschungsamt, Göring's Signals Intelligence Service, had intercepted American commercial radio traffic discussing petroleum shipments. The volumes matched the agent reports. Luftwaffe reconnaissance of North African ports showed American fuel dumps that exceeded German strategic reserves. Even the language was revealing. Americans discussed petroleum in terms of millions of barrels, the way German quartermasters discussed liters. By February of 1943, Heidelberg had assembled enough data to attempt a comprehensive assessment. He worked alone, reluctant to share preliminary findings that seemed to defy rationality. His office became a fortress of papers, maps pinned to walls showing American oil fields, refinery locations, pipeline routes. Photographs of Texas derricks stretched across his desk, forests of steel rising from earth that seemed to bleed petroleum. The turning point came when he obtained a copy of an American trade publication, the Oil and Gas Journal, smuggled through Switzerland. Dated November 1942, it contained an article celebrating American petroleum production reaching new heights to support the war effort. The author casually mentioned that daily production had exceeded 4 million barrels, treating this figure as a matter of pride rather than strategic secrecy. 4 million barrels daily. Heidelberg stared at the number until the ink seemed to blur. Germany's entire petroleum supply, synthetic and natural combined, barely exceeded 300,000 barrels daily. If this American publication was accurate, and he had no reason to doubt a civilian trade journal reporting domestic industrial achievements, then the United States produced more than 13 times Germany's total petroleum output. Not 13% more, 13 times more. He spent 3 days verifying the calculation, approaching it from different angles, searching for errors that would restore sanity to the numbers. American oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and Louisiana were documented. Each field's production could be estimated from well counts visible in reconnaissance photographs. Refinery capacity could be calculated from the size of distillation towers and storage tanks. Pipeline construction was visible in aerial surveys. Every method of verification pointed to the same conclusion. The United States produced approximately 4.7 million barrels of petroleum daily. Germany, including all occupied territories and synthetic production, managed 124,000 barrels from natural wells, and perhaps another 176,000 from synthetic plants. The ratio was approximately 15-1 in America's favor, a disparity so vast it seemed to exist in a different category of comparison, not an advantage but a different reality altogether. Heidelberg understood what this meant with the clarity of a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. Germany was attempting to wage mechanized warfare against an enemy whose petroleum resources exceeded German capacity by 1,500%. Every German tank, every aircraft, every truck consumed fuel that represented scarce, irreplaceable strategic reserves. Every American vehicle burned fuel drawn from an ocean of abundance so vast that waste was meaningless. The implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling. The Luftwaffe's pilot training program had been cut to 60 hours because of fuel shortages. American pilots, according to interrogation reports, received 250 hours of flight training. German tank commanders practiced maneuvers with reduced fuel allocations, learning to conserve every liter. American tankers apparently trained with full fuel loads, unlimited practice runs, their doctrine built on mobility that German forces couldn't match because they couldn't afford the gasoline. The U-boat campaign, which Heidelberg had been tasked to support, suddenly appeared in a different light. Donitz submarines were sinking Allied tankers, true enough. 500,000 tons sunk in January alone. But if America produced 4.7 million barrels daily, approximately 700,000 tons, then daily production replaced weekly sinkings. The U-boats weren't interdicting American fuel supplies. They were barely making a dent in the overflow. Worse, each U-boat sortie consumed fuel. Type 7 submarines carried 114 tons of diesel for combat operations. Type 9 boats needed 165 tons. The Kriegsmarine was burning precious fuel to sink tankers carrying fuel the Americans could easily replace from current production. The mathematics of attrition worked entirely in America's favor. Heidelberg drafted his report on March 5, 1943, working through the night. His methodology was rigorous, each claim supported by multiple sources, every calculation checked and rechecked. He documented field-by-field American production estimates, refinery capacity assessments, transportation infrastructure analysis. The conclusion was inescapable and devastating. United States petroleum production capacity exceeds combined Axis output by factor of approximately 12:1. German Reich cannot achieve strategic victory in prolonged mechanized conflict against opponent possessing such material superiority. Recommend immediate reassessment of operational planning based on revised petroleum availability projections. He read the words again, struck by their inadequacy. How could bureaucratic language capture what he'd discovered? Germany wasn't losing a petroleum competition. Germany had already lost before the first shot was fired. The war was a mathematical impossibility disguised as a military conflict. The rain had stopped. Pale morning light filtered through the windows of Heidelberg's office, illuminating maps covered in red circles marking American oil fields. He'd counted them obsessively during the night. Texas alone had more producing wells than existed in all of Europe. Oklahoma's fields exceeded North African production. California's refineries could supply the entire Wehrmacht with fuel and barely notice the drain. He thought of the propaganda he'd read, the certainty that German discipline and superior tactics would overcome material disadvantages. But there were limits to what courage could achieve against mathematics. 100 skilled pilots couldn't win air superiority if they flew 60 hours of training versus the enemy's 250 hours. The finest tank commanders couldn't execute mobile warfare if they measured fuel in liters while opponents measured it in thousands of gallons. Heidelberg placed his report in a folder marked for immediate attention to the Chief of Intelligence. He knew what would happen. The report would circulate upward through the command structure until it reached someone who understood its implications. Then it would be suppressed, dismissed as defeatist, or simply ignored because accepting its truth meant accepting that Germany had already lost the war. But he'd done his duty. The intelligence was accurate, methodical, undeniable. If Germany's leadership chose to ignore what American petroleum production meant for the war's outcome, that was beyond his control. He was merely an analyst, a man who added numbers and reported what they revealed. As he walked home through Berlin's damaged streets, Heidelberg couldn't shake the image of those Texas oil derricks, thousands of them, pumping ceaselessly, each one producing more petroleum in a day than some German synthetic plants produced in a week. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in a country he'd never seen, the earth itself seemed to be fighting for America, bleeding oil in quantities that made German scarcity appear almost supernatural in its completeness. The report reached General Major Reinhard Gehlen, head of Fremdheer Ost, Foreign Armies East, on March 10, 1943. Gehlen was not a man prone to panic. His intelligence assessments of Soviet capabilities had earned him respect even from those who despised his cold precision. He read Heidelberg's report twice, made notes in the margins, then requested a meeting with the analyst. They met in a secure conference room, windows covered with blackout curtains despite the morning hour. Gehlen placed the folder on the table between them, his expression unreadable. "These numbers," Gehlen said quietly, tapping the production estimates. "You're certain?" Heidelberg nodded. "I verified them through 7 independent sources, Herr General. Photographic reconnaissance, signal intercepts, neutral shipping reports, captured documents, and open-source American publications. The methodology is detailed in Appendix C. 4.7 million barrels daily." Gehlen's voice carried no inflection, as though speaking the number aloud might make it more real than he could bear. "And we produce 124,000 from natural wells, perhaps 200,000 total including synthetic production. On optimal days." Gehlen was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the folder. Finally he spoke. Do you understand what you're asking me to do with this information? Do you comprehend what reporting this up the chain means? Heidelberg met his gaze. I understand it means telling the truth, Herr General. The truth. Gellin laughed. A bitter sound. The Führer doesn't want truth. He wants victory. Speer wants production miracles. Donitz wants U-boat tonnage numbers. And you want me to tell them that we're burning 1 cup of water while the enemy drowns us with an ocean. The numbers are accurate. I don't doubt your numbers, Oberstleutnant. I doubt whether anyone will listen. Gellin stood, pacing to the covered window. But you're right. We must report it. And then we must watch as it's ignored, dismissed, or buried under optimistic projections that make generals feel better about sending men to die. The report traveled upward through the command structure over the following weeks. Each stop brought new resistance. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht questioned the methodology. Speer's Ministry of Armaments challenged the American production figures as propaganda. The Kriegsmarine dismissed the implications for U-boat warfare, citing recent tonnage successes. But the numbers wouldn't change. Heidelberg was called to defend his analysis 3 times in March, each briefing more hostile than the last. Senior officers, men whose careers depended on optimistic projections, attacked his sources, his calculations, his conclusions. A Generaloberst accused him of defeatism. A Reichsmarshal's deputy suggested the intelligence was Allied disinformation. Through it all, Heidelberg remained calm, presenting evidence with academic precision. He showed photographs of American refineries, each one larger than Germany's biggest facilities. He displayed shipping manifests documenting petroleum flows that exceeded German annual production. He quoted American oil industry publications that treated 4 million barrels daily as routine achievement rather than strategic miracle. The briefing that mattered came on April 2, 1943, in the Reich Chancellery. Present were Keitel, Jodl, Speer, and several department heads. Heidelberg had 30 minutes to present findings that undermined Germany's entire strategic framework. He began with a map showing global petroleum production. The United States dominated, a massive red circle dwarfing everything else. Germany's contribution appeared as barely visible dot. Then came the comparative analysis, American production by state versus German production by source. Texas alone outproduced the entire Reich by factor of 8. California exceeded Romanian output by 3 to 1. Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania combined produced more than all of German-occupied Europe, including synthetic plants. Speer interrupted, his voice sharp. These American figures assume maximum capacity with no operational constraints. War disrupts production. Refineries require maintenance. Wells deplete. Your analysis doesn't account for realistic limitations. Heidelberg had anticipated this. Respectfully, Herr Reichsminister, American production has increased since entering the war. December 1941 production was 4.2 million barrels daily. Current production exceeds 4.7 million. They're expanding capacity during wartime, not contracting it. Impossible, someone muttered. Nevertheless accurate. Heidelberg displayed reconnaissance photographs showing new refineries under construction in Texas and New Jersey. They're building additional capacity while fighting on multiple fronts. Our synthetic plants struggle to maintain current output. They're adding millions of barrels annually to already overwhelming production. The room fell silent. Keitel studied the photographs, his expression grim. Jodl made calculations on a notepad, his pencil scratching loudly in the quiet. Speer stared at the production charts as though will alone could change the numbers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Finally, Keitel spoke. Operational implications? Heidelberg had prepared for this question, knowing it would determine whether his report mattered or disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Herr General Feldmarschall, every aspect of modern warfare depends on petroleum. The enemy possesses effectively unlimited fuel while we ration every liter. This affects training, mobility, air operations, naval capacity, and industrial production. He clicked to the next slide, showing comparative fuel allocations. Luftwaffe pilot training has been reduced to 60 hours due to fuel constraints. American pilots receive 250 hours minimum, often more. Our tank crews practice maneuvers with restricted fuel loads. American armored forces train with unlimited fuel, developing doctrine based on mobility we cannot match. The U-boat campaign? Asked a Kriegsmarine admiral, his tone defensive. We're sinking tankers carrying fuel the Americans replace from 3 days' production. Each U-boat sortie consumes fuel equivalent to what we're trying to interdict. Mathematically, we cannot win a tonnage war against opponent who produces 15 times our petroleum output. The admiral's face reddened, but he said nothing. The numbers were too clear to dispute. Heidelberg continued, his voice steady despite the tension filling the room. Most critically, American petroleum abundance enables operational flexibility we cannot counter. They move entire armies because they have fuel for thousands of trucks. They maintain constant air superiority because they can fly unlimited sorties. They replace losses quickly because their industrial base runs on abundant energy. He paused, letting the implications settle. Germany fights a fuel-constrained war. Every operation must account for limited petroleum availability. America fights with fuel abundance that makes our constraints invisible to them. This disparity grows more pronounced as the war continues. Speer leaned forward. Your analysis assumes current conditions persist. What if we increase synthetic production? The Luna expansion will add 50,000 barrels daily by year's end. 50,000 barrels. Heidelberg kept his voice neutral. America's production increased by 500,000 barrels daily since Pearl Harbor. We're accelerating while they're sprinting, and the gap widens monthly. Jodl set down his pencil. What you're describing is mathematical impossibility of victory in prolonged conflict. Yes, Herr General Oberst. Precisely. The room erupted. Officers spoke over each other, challenging methodology, questioning sources, demanding alternative explanations. But beneath the resistance, Heidelberg sensed something else, the terrible recognition that he was right, that Germany had committed to a war it couldn't win because the enemy possessed resources beyond German comprehension. Keitel finally restored order. This analysis will be classified at highest level. Oberstleutnant Heidelberg, you will prepare detailed assessment of petroleum-based constraints on specific operations. We need to understand practical limitations, not just strategic implications. The meeting ended without resolution, but Heidelberg knew his report had struck home. In the following weeks, he was tasked with assessments that revealed petroleum shortages' pervasive effects on German military capabilities. For Operation Citadel, the planned Kursk offensive, Heidelberg calculated fuel requirements for the massive panzer formations. 4th Panzer Army alone needed 8,000 cubic meters of fuel for the operation, approximately 50,000 barrels. This represented nearly half of Germany's daily petroleum production allocated to single operations opening phase. The Soviets, supplied by American Lend-Lease Petroleum, had no such constraints. He analyzed Luftwaffe operations over the Reich. Fighter squadrons defending German cities flew ration sorties. Pilots grounded to conserve fuel while American bombers approached. The same B-17s burned fuel at rates that would ground entire Luftwaffe Gestschwaders. Each 1,000-bomber raid consumed more fuel in one operation than Germany allocated to home defense weekly. The Mediterranean theater revealed similar disparities. Rommel's Afrika Corps had collapsed not from tactical defeat but logistical starvation. While British forces received steady petroleum supplies through Allied convoys, German forces in North Africa consumed their fuel reserves simply maintaining positions. Every liter transported across the Mediterranean cost 3 liters in tanker fuel and convoy protection. The mathematics ensured German defeat regardless of battlefield performance. Perhaps most disturbing, Heidelberg discovered that German intelligence had possessed fragmentary evidence of American petroleum abundance since 1940. Reports existed, filed and forgotten, documenting vast American production. But the information had been dismissed as exaggeration, the numbers too large to be credible. German planners, operating within framework of scarcity, couldn't conceive of abundance at American scales. An Abwehr report from May 1940 described Texas oil fields visible from high-altitude reconnaissance. The analyst estimated production based on well counts but reduced his figures by half because the original numbers seemed implausible. Even then, the reduced estimate exceeded German production threefold. A Kriegsmarine intelligence assessment from 1941 noted American tanker construction suggesting petroleum surplus beyond military needs. The conclusion: Americans must be inefficient, wasteful, overbuilding capacity they couldn't possibly utilize. The idea that America actually produced enough petroleum to justify such tanker fleets was dismissed as illogical. Time and again, German intelligence had encountered evidence of American petroleum dominance and rejected it because accepting the truth meant confronting Germany's hopeless strategic position. It was easier to believe in exaggeration, propaganda, or analytical error than to admit the war was mathematically unwinnable. Heidelberg compiled these historical failures into a supplementary report titled Intelligence Assessment Methodology and Cognitive Bias in Strategic Analysis. It was his gentlest possible indictment of a system that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The report circulated briefly before being quietly filed away. By summer 1943, Heidelberg's analysis had become open secret among senior intelligence officers. They discussed it quietly, in secure rooms, speaking in careful language that avoided direct defeatism. But the knowledge spread, infecting strategic planning with creeping awareness that petroleum constraints made German victory impossible. The effect appeared in operational planning. Proposals for ambitious offensives were quietly reduced in scope. Fuel allocations became primary constraint in every operation order. Commanders learned to plan battles around petroleum availability rather than tactical opportunity. The war contracted, shrinking from grand strategic visions to desperate struggles to maintain positions with ever-diminishing resources. Heidelberg observed this transformation with mixture of vindication and despair. He'd been right, his analysis was accurate, his warnings valid. But being right meant watching Germany slide toward inevitable defeat, powerless to change course because the strategic decisions had been made years earlier, before anyone understood what American petroleum abundance meant for modern warfare. In September 1943, he was summoned to brief the Führer's military adjutant on petroleum constraints affecting Eastern Front operations. The briefing never mentioned Heidelberg's original report, but the questions revealed its influence. How much fuel for winter operations? What happens if Caucasus oil fields aren't captured? Can synthetic production meet minimum requirements? Heidelberg answered honestly, documenting shortages that made mobile warfare increasingly impossible. German forces were becoming static, defensive, forced into positional warfare by fuel scarcity while enemies maneuvered freely, fueled by abundance Germany couldn't match. The adjutant listened grimly, taking notes. At the end, he asked the question that haunted German planning. Is there any scenario where we overcome this disadvantage? Heidelberg considered his response carefully. Only if American production collapses or we develop entirely new energy sources. Neither seems likely. So we fight a war we cannot win. We fight a war we could not have won from the beginning. American petroleum production in 1939 already exceeded our capacity by factor of 10. The gap has only widened. The adjutant closed his notebook. This conversation did not occur. Understood. But conversations were occurring throughout German high command. Officers who'd read Heidelberg's report or its derivatives understood the strategic reality. They continued fighting because duty demanded it, because withdrawal wasn't permitted, because hoping for miracles seemed preferable to accepting mathematical certainty of defeat. The knowledge created strange cognitive dissonance among German military leadership. They planned operations knowing fuel shortages would cripple execution. They ordered offensives while calculating petroleum requirements they couldn't meet. They read reports of American petroleum abundance and continued fighting as though willpower could overcome industrial capacity. Heidelberg documented this surreal disconnect in private journals never intended for official record. We are men who know the building is collapsing but continue rearranging furniture because we cannot admit the foundation is gone. He wrote in October 1943. American fuel flows like water while we measure drops. And still we plan as though determination matters more than mathematics. The winter of 1943 brought new evidence of American petroleum dominance. Allied bombing of German synthetic fuel plants revealed how fragile German production was. Attacks on Luna in May reduced output by 40%. Strikes against Politz and Blechhammer crippled additional capacity. By year's end, German petroleum production had fallen below 150,000 barrels daily, less than 4% of American output. Meanwhile, American production continued growing. New wells in Texas, expanded refineries in California, increased throughput from existing facilities. By December 1943, American daily production exceeded 5 million barrels, an increase of 300,000 barrels daily in 1 year. America's annual production increase exceeded Germany's total annual output. Heidelberg prepared quarterly updates tracking this divergence. Each report documented widening gap between American abundance and German scarcity. Each showed German options contracting as petroleum constraints tightened. Each was filed, read by those who needed to know, and carefully not discussed in official planning sessions. The effect appeared in battlefield reality. Luftwaffe sorties declined monthly despite increasing Allied air attacks. Panzer divisions sat immobile while Red Army tank armies maneuvered around them. U-boats remained in port for lack of fuel, their crews trained to peak efficiency but unable to reach operational areas. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet rusted at anchor, beautiful ships rendered useless by empty fuel bunkers. In January 1944, Heidelberg was ordered to assess fuel requirements for defending against expected Allied invasion of France. His calculations showed the impossibility clearly. Mobile defense required fuel for rapid redeployment. Germany didn't have fuel for sustained mobile operations. Static defense required fuel for transportation, logistics, and reserve movements. Germany barely had fuel for minimum requirements. He presented 3 scenarios, each ending in defeat. Optimistic scenario. Fuel shortages limit German response speed, allowing Allies to establish beachhead. Probable scenario. Fuel constraints prevent effective counterattack. Allies break out from beachhead. Pessimistic scenario. Fuel shortage causes operational collapse. German forces immobilized. The briefing officer read Heidelberg's assessment silently, his face showing no emotion. You're saying we cannot prevent Allied landing. I'm saying petroleum constraints prevent effective response regardless of tactical skill or operational planning. The Allies will have unlimited fuel for their operations. We will not. This is defeatist. This is mathematics, Herr Oberst. The assessment was filed. 3 months later, Allied forces landed at Normandy with fuel support beyond German comprehension. American supply dumps in Britain contained over 100 million gallons of petroleum products before D-Day. The invasion fleet consumed fuel at rates exceeding total German daily production just across the channel. Within weeks of landing, Allies had established fuel depots in France that individually exceeded German strategic reserves. Heidelberg watched reports of Allied advance, tracking fuel consumption figures when available. American armies moved with mobility German forces couldn't match because Americans had unlimited fuel while Germans measured liters. The Red Ball Express, American truck convoy system, burned more fuel daily than entire German Army Group West received weekly. Yet Americans maintained advance, their fuel supplies never wavering. By August 1944, Allied bombing had reduced German petroleum production to critical levels. Synthetic fuel output fell below 50,000 barrels daily. Romanian oil fields were lost to Soviet advances. German forces faced petroleum crisis so severe that Luftwaffe virtually ceased operations. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel, and entire divisions moved by foot because trucks sat empty. Heidelberg compiled final comprehensive assessment in September 1944. The document, classified at highest level, concluded that Germany's petroleum situation had become catastrophic. Daily production barely exceeded 30,000 barrels. Daily consumption, even with severe rationing, required over 100,000 barrels. The deficit was being met by consuming strategic reserves that would be exhausted by year's end. German military forces cannot maintain current operations beyond December 1944 due to petroleum depletion, the assessment concluded. No combination of synthetic production increases, conservation measures, or captured stocks can reverse this trajectory. Strategic defeat is inevitable absent negotiated settlement. The report circulated to Keitel, Jodl, Speer, and several others. No one ordered rebuttal analysis. No one challenged the findings. The silence was acknowledgement that Heidelberg had been right from the beginning, that his March 1943 assessment had predicted exactly what was occurring, that American petroleum abundance had predetermined the war's outcome before Germany understood what it faced. In December 1944, as Germany launched the Ardennes offensive with fuel allocations known to be insufficient, Heidelberg understood the desperation driving the operation. German commanders hoped to capture American fuel stocks because Germany had none. The operation's success depended on taking enemy supplies because German production couldn't support offensive operations. When reports came back of German columns finding American fuel depots containing thousands of gallons, then discovering Americans destroying millions of gallons rather than risk capture, Heidelberg wasn't surprised. He'd calculated those numbers 2 years earlier. Americans could casually destroy more fuel than Germany possessed because American daily production exceeded German monthly production. The Ardennes collapse confirmed everything. German forces immobilized by empty tanks. American forces advancing with unlimited fuel. The visual metaphor of the war's petroleum disparity playing out in frozen Belgian forests where German tactical skill meant nothing against American logistical abundance. By spring 1945, German petroleum production had effectively ceased. Synthetic plants were destroyed or captured. Romanian fields were lost. Remaining wells produced barely enough to maintain emergency services. The Luftwaffe was grounded. The Kriegsmarine was immobilized. Wehrmacht divisions fought without mobility, tied to positions because they lacked fuel to maneuver. Heidelberg spent the war's final weeks destroying documents that might compromise intelligence sources. His reports on American petroleum production were burned, the analysis that had been too accurate, too early, too honest for German leadership to accept. But he kept personal copies, hidden carefully, documenting how intelligence had revealed truth that ideology rejected. When American forces reached Berlin, Heidelberg surrendered with his personal archive intact. His interrogators, intelligence officers who understood petroleum logistics, read his 1943 assessment with growing respect. "You calculated American production at 4.7 million barrels daily," the interrogator said. "Our actual production averaged 4.9 million in 1943. I was conservative in my estimates. You knew Germany couldn't win. I knew the mathematics made victory impossible. Whether Germany could win depended on factors beyond petroleum, but petroleum guaranteed Germany couldn't win through military means." The interrogator studied Heidelberg's analysis of German cognitive bias, the section explaining why leadership rejected evidence of American abundance. "You're saying your own command structure couldn't accept reality? No one wants to believe they've committed to impossible war. Accepting my analysis meant accepting that every soldier's death served no strategic purpose, that courage and sacrifice couldn't overcome industrial mathematics. Easier to dismiss the numbers than face that truth." Heidelberg's documents became part of United States Strategic Bombing Survey. His analysis cited in sections examining German petroleum vulnerability. His 1943 assessment was referenced in post-war studies of intelligence failure, held up as example of accurate analysis rejected for ideological reasons. But Heidelberg himself disappeared into anonymity. He had no interest in fame for being right about Germany's defeat. He'd been an analyst who calculated numbers and reported conclusions, nothing more. That his conclusions proved accurate brought no satisfaction, only quiet grief for all those who died fighting war that mathematics had already decided. In 1952, an American petroleum industry journal interviewed former German intelligence officers about wartime assessments. Heidelberg was contacted but declined. The editor persisted, eventually convincing him to provide brief written statement. "I calculated that American petroleum production exceeded German output by factor of 15 to 1, Heidelberg wrote. This ratio made German military victory mathematically impossible regardless of tactical or operational skill. The tragedy was not that Germany lost, But that loss was predetermined by industrial factors apparent to anyone who honestly assessed the data. We fought a war the numbers had already decided. The statement was published alongside American petroleum production statistics. In 1943, United States petroleum output was indeed 4.9 million barrels daily, representing 67% of global production. Germany's total output, including synthetic and all-occupied territory, never exceeded 300,000 barrels daily, less than 2% of American production. Those who studied the numbers understood what Heidelberg had grasped in March 1943. Modern warfare was industrial contest where petroleum availability determined capability. Training, doctrine, tactical skill mattered, but abundance overwhelmed excellence. An enemy with unlimited fuel defeated opponent measuring leaders, regardless of how skilled the fuel-starved side might be. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Future conflicts between industrial powers would be decided by production capacity more than battlefield prowess. The side with abundant resources could afford waste, mistakes, and inefficiency while still overwhelming opponent constrained by scarcity. Germany's tactical excellence couldn't overcome American industrial abundance because the abundance operated at scale that made efficiency irrelevant. Heidelberg died in 1978, largely forgotten except by specialists in military intelligence history. His obituary in a Munich newspaper mentioned his Abwehr service but not his petroleum analysis. The work that had consumed years of his life, that had revealed truth too devastating to accept, merited no public recognition. But his documents survived in archives, studied by historians and military planners. The 1943 assessment became case study in intelligence analysis, demonstrating how accurate prediction matters less than whether leadership accepts findings. Heidelberg had been right. His analysis was methodologically sound, his conclusions valid, his warnings prophetic. None of it mattered because truth conflicted with ideology. The supreme irony was that German leadership, obsessed with will and determination overcoming material disadvantage, ignored the one factor that determined modern warfare's outcome. They believed spirit could defeat steel, that courage could overcome industrial capacity. Heidelberg's numbers proved otherwise. American petroleum abundance, boring and unglamorous compared to warrior ethos, was the strategic factor that ensured Allied victory. In the end, the maps weren't wrong. The world was exactly as Heidelberg's calculations described. Germany fought war with petroleum production of 124,000 barrels daily against enemy producing 4.7 million barrels daily. The mathematics were inescapable. The outcome was predetermined. And Oberstleutnant Werner Heidelberg spent 3 years watching Germany refuse to accept what the numbers plainly revealed. The thunder of guns has long since faded, but the lesson remains. In industrial warfare, abundance defeats excellence. Resources overcome courage. And the side that can waste more than the enemy possesses will prevail, regardless of valor, skill, or determination. Heidelberg calculated this truth in 1943. The world learned it through millions of deaths over the following 2 years. Sometimes the most important intelligence is the analysis that no one wants to hear. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.